one of the perennial questions is if there is ultimately a conflict, say, between a safety requirement and a security requirement, which one should prevail, which one should win, for want of a better way of saying it. By having robust design principles for things like memory access and memory control, it's a benefit for both functional safety and cybersecurity. There's that saying about something being written by a committee, and standards are quite literally written by committees, but we have to make sure that they represent and agreed in industry positions.
Hello and welcome to Ingenuity, the podcast series from HORIBA MIRA, where we go behind the scenes of next generation vehicle development. I'm thrilled to be joined again by Dr. David Ward. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Today I'm going to be putting your questions to David. We're going to start talking about ISO 26262. And you mentioned when we spoke before about the revisions that are coming.
That's
One
right.
of the questions was, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I'd really like to tell you lots about it, but obviously, as I think I mentioned before, there are some confidentiality clauses around standards development. We'll perhaps come on to how standards are made and what information is and isn't available later on, because I know there was a couple of questions about that. So I can talk in fairly general terms, but obviously the other factor is that until we've reviewed requests that people have made for changes and made decisions, it will be a bit premature to say a particular topic definitely is or isn't coming in the next edition of the standard. What I can say is that in October 2024, we officially started the revision. We'd done some preparatory work before that, looking at some of the key topics that people saw that we needed to address. We've collected an initial round of comments that we're starting to work through. So as I say, until we've made some of the key decisions, until we go to a public ballot, it wouldn't be appropriate to share information that may or may not make it to the final cut, as it were. But I think there are some directions of travel that are fairly evident anyway. Over the course of preparing for the new edition of the standard, we've released some supplementary documents. There's one on addressing the wider safety issues of new energy vehicles, for example. There's another one on the use of complex pre-existing software. So those have been issued as standalone documents. So we now need to look at if and how those could be integrated into the next edition of the standard. There's the perennial question of the alignment between 26262 and SOTIF, and there's generally a desire to make those perhaps a little more closely aligned, so it's very clear when 26262 applies, when SOTIF particularly applies, what the differences are. So those, I think, it's fair to say will be some of the general directions of travel, and I think if you look at various public fora, then those are the kind of questions that people are talking about and discussing.
Yeah, definitely. So we know that vehicles are getting more complex in terms of their use of software. Right, yeah. As you say, we know that new energy systems need to be incorporated. And I like that sense of you getting a bit of clarity around, as you say, ISO 26262 and SOTIF and how they interact. So that all sounds really positive. How would you respond then to criticisms about ISO 26262 and the fact that maybe it's out of date? Do you think that's right?
I don't think that's right. I think you have to recognise that when we develop a standard, there's always this sense of how do we keep things up to date versus how do we give stability and clarity to end users of the document. So when we release a standard like 26262, people put a lot of effort into developing and aligning their company processes, in developing products according to the standards. So there's a sense in which we need to give some stability. We shouldn't always be changing the standard, because then people will be chasing a moving target. We need to give some stability and some continuity to people using the standard. At the same time, we need to recognise that the world does change, and inevitably there's an extent to which any standard that anyone produces is a snapshot in time of what people were doing, and at that particular point in time. So there's always this question of how do you future-proof a standard like 26262, and that is actually something that we already took into account right back from the beginning of 26262, particularly in the software part of the standard. We recognise that what would represent the current good practice, the state of the art, if you like, particularly when it comes to things like software development, was going to be subject to rapid change. So we quite deliberately set the standard up with some flexibility. I think, unfortunately, people don't always realise that that flexibility is there or understand the way that it's intended to be applied. But some of the decisions that we made quite early on in 26262, the way that things have developed, particularly around software, it's proven that those are actually quite good and, quite insightful decisions that we made at the time. But I think, as we've said, the standard always needs to be applied intelligently. I think there are people that are wanting a recipe book or a cookbook, and as soon as you if you pardon the pun, hard code something like 26262 into a particular activity that was in fashion at the time, it could date very quickly. We've quite deliberately allowed flexibility in the standard. It's not carte blanche to do what you like, but at the same time, there is a lot of adaptability for the future.
So you always knew it would be an evolution rather than a revolution?
That's right, yeah.
And you referenced this earlier, but one of the questions is about who makes these standards, who comes together and decides what goes into them?
That's a really good question. So ultimately, standards like 26262 are developed by international working groups, and I think that's really important to emphasise that those groups represent a diverse set of opinions. So they come from people in different parts of the world, they come from organisations in different parts of the supply chain, so people like vehicle manufacturers, various levels of component suppliers, consulting organisations such as ourselves. So it's really important that we have a broad range of opinions and expertise in developing a standard like that. At the same time, there has to be some structure to it so that we can actually reach an agreement. There's that saying about something being written by committee, and standards are quite literally written by committees, but we have to make sure that they represent an agreed industry position. So ultimately, the content in 26262 is decided by an international working group, but that's supported by national experts. There's various rounds of consultations that take place. So, as I say, there's a diverse group of people representing a cross-industry perspective. So what's really important in a standard like 26262 is that it represents the agreed way of working across the whole industry, that it's not just focused in on, say, one or two companies and what they particularly want to do. And I think that's one of the really great advantages of the way that a standards organisation like ISO works, that it's a broad range of opinions, and there's a lot of opportunities for people to get involved and to have a say, initially through national working groups and then through the international committee as well.
Brilliant. And one of the questions is about ISO 26262 using more examples. Is that something you think it should do?
That's one of those questions that we've debated at length over the years. And again, there's always a fine balance between how much detail do you give. The more detail you give, then the more it gets tied into particular solutions, the more it gets tied into a particular way of doing things that perhaps was the state of the art at the time, but things may develop over time. So there's a very fine balance, and I think the fundamental premise in some standards in general, and 26262 in particular, is we assume that it's being applied by people who are already competent to do things like designing electronic hardware or specifying, developing, implementing software. So there's a basic level of competence and knowledge that's assumed, and then 26262 tells you what you need to do on top of that to meet the needs of functional safety. As I say, we've quite often had this debate, and I think we'll come back to it again about how many examples we give. I think it is useful to have examples to illustrate what we're thinking about, but obviously, even where we give examples in the standard, people need to understand they are just examples. They're They're not exhaustive. They're not saying this is the way to coin a phrase. There can be other ways of doing things. So I think it's really important that people understand that. And we've had the situation in the past where we gave some advice on the standard, and then someone turned around and said, well, you've not done this, this, and this that are in the standard. And we said, well, that's because they're just there as examples. They're showing one way that someone could choose to do something, but it's very clear that those are only examples, and you are free to do things in a different way that still meets the requirements of the standard, which is actually what we've done in that case.
Brilliant. So you don't want it to be too restrictive, and examples could potentially make it
exactly. We don't want it to be too restrictive. We don't want it to be a cookbook, because ultimately a standard like 26262 is a process framework. It tells you what you need to do to help achieve a safe product and to address functional safety. We try to avoid saying this is how you have to do it. You do have to do it in a particular way.
And I think what's usually reassuring as well about what you've said is that diverse group of people that you bring together so that you can cover all the different aspects. So whilst ensuring it's not too restrictive, you've got that really comprehensive view of the whole area, not, as you say, the whole supply chain.
That's right, yeah.
So one of the questions we've had come in is about how the standard ISO 26262 relates to historical approaches. So the complex electronics, for example, or the e-gas approach. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure, yes. So both of those are concepts or frameworks that actually both predate 26262, but say quite a lot about functional safety. If we take e-gas first of all, that's a standardized safety concept that was developed by a group of vehicle manufacturers when systems like electronic throttle control were first being introduced into vehicles, and the latest versions of the e-gas concept have now been aligned to the concepts and terminology of 26262. So in 26262 terms, effectively what e-gas describes is a technical safety concept. So it talks about the types of faults and failures that you need to detect and the types of reactions that should be given to those. So what the e-gas document does is it has a very high level, what we call a functional safety concept in 26262. It is very high level, and it says you should monitor sensors for their plausibility, you should monitor actuators for error, you should do closed loop monitoring of the demanded torque versus the delivered torque in a powertrain, and then it expands into the particular types of sensors, the types of faults, the types of monitoring that you'd require. But clearly any company developing something like a powertrain control system would then go away and do their own design and implementation that fulfills that standardized structure. And in 26262 terms, what we'd see is that you'd still need to apply some of the architectural design and evaluation techniques in 26262 to implement some of the requirements of something like the e-gas concept. And what we'd say now, if a company's developing something like a powertrain control system, they may well know that something like the e-gas concept is ultimately what they're going to use as their safety concept and their monitoring concept, but you still have to do the hazard analysis, you still have to do the functional safety concept for your particular application, and then see to what extent a standardized concept like e-gas fulfills what you need. And it may be as part of that exercise you find it matches everything. It may be that the particular application brings some additional or different needs that you also need to cover. You also mentioned complex electronics, and that's a rather different approach, because that's actually part of regulatory requirements. So the so-called complex electronics annex emerged initially as part of the type approval requirements for braking system in vehicles, and it was initially created sometime before 26262 emerged, but to deal with the emergence of systems such as anti-lock brakes and electronic stability control. And when they talk about complex systems, what they're talking about there is not the technical complexity of the solution or the implementation, but the fact that there's a hierarchy of control where the electronic system can intervene in or modify the driver demand, or even create demand for something like braking independently of the driver. So, as I say, although it was originally conceived for systems like ABS, it's now applicable to a wide range of braking-related functionality in vehicles, including things like adaptive cruise control, regenerative braking, etc. What you have to bear in mind is that because it's part of a regulatory requirement, the way that type approval works is that it's effectively it's a review by an approval authority, and the presumption is that there's an engineering process in place which is being followed, and then the regulation lists the things that the approval authority is going to check or independently evaluate. So we like to describe the complex electronic system, the complex electronic systems annex, as being functional safety light, if we can call it that. It's a very high level set of requirements. It's a minimum set of requirements for what an approval authority would look at to have confidence that an appropriate approach in functional safety is being followed. And of course, an organisation that's following ISO 26262 should have no difficulty in producing the information and the artifacts that are needed to satisfy that regulatory requirement. What we have seen over the years is that as new requirements and new technologies in vehicles have emerged, then the regulations have started to move a little bit closer to 26262. As of the point that we're speaking, it's still not a direct regulatory requirement to apply 26262, but some of the most recent regulations actually require that the personnel in the type approval authority that are doing the evaluation are themselves competent in 26262 and related standards. So that will be the frame of reference that they will have been trained against and are using to judge vehicles and their systems that are submitted for approval. So we see these regulations moving close to 26262, whilst they don't yet directly require it. Then clearly, as ever, it's a very good idea to follow 26262 because it's the agreed industry approach, and it's the frame of reference that both people developing vehicles and also regulators are referring to.
So that's really interesting. That, as you said, it's almost that the standard's been set, and then the regulatory bodies are now looking to that.
Yeah.
So whilst it's not a direct correlation, actually there is that approach is recognised.
Yeah, but even some of the language that you see used in both EGAS and the Complex Electronics Annex, they both talk about safety concept, and we use the term safety concept in ISO 26262 to describe the strategy that you're going to use to address failures, to maintain the vehicle in a safe state in the presence of failures.
So we've had a couple of questions come in about how functional safety and relates to cybersecurity. And one of the questions is about how a standard like ISO 26262 works with the other standard. Is it 21434?
ISO SA 21434.
There we are. I was going to say, I knew you'd know exactly what it was. And so how do those two standards interact?
So both of those standards have what we call a risk-based approach. So they're both a framework for identifying, in the case of 26262, hazards, in the case of cybersecurity threats, evaluating the risk associated with those hazards or threats, and then taking appropriate steps to mitigate those risks. So I think there are a lot of synergies, there's a lot of commonality between them. So we've always said at HORIBA MIRA that if a system isn't secure, it's unlikely to be safe. So we've always seen a close link between safety and security. So I think there are a lot of benefits from trying to align approaches. We do see some very different interpretations, and it is clear that functional safety and cybersecurity are different disciplines with different skill sets, different approaches, but it does make sense where possible to combine activities to get synergies from them. So there are some obvious touch points between the processes. So both functional safety and cybersecurity require something called an item definition, which is essentially defining what the product is that we're going to apply the engineering process to. So it would be possible, for example, to have a combined item definition, although the detailed scope for a particular electronic system might be different between what's in scope of functional safety and what's in scope of cybersecurity. When we look at the risk analysis, we have the HARA, the hazard analysis and risk assessment in functional safety. We have the TARA, or threat analysis and risk assessment in cybersecurity. They are quite different approaches, but there are some linkages between them. So For safety-related threats in the cybersecurity domain, we are required to use the same severity classifications as we use in ISO 26262. And then when it comes to things like the functional safety concept, for example, we would need to consider from a functional safety perspective whether a cybersecurity aspect could be the cause of unsafe behaviour that needs to be addressed. As we specify requirements between functional safety and cybersecurity, for example, we need to look at any potential conflicts between them. So, for example, from a cybersecurity perspective, there may be a requirement to consider things like encryption and authentication in communications. From a functional safety perspective, we'd be interested to know what processing overhead that brings, and does that affect, say, any critical timing requirements of a safety strategy. So I think it's really important, even if those are being worked on by different teams, to have those touch points and to have the interactions between them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's why somewhere like HORIBA MIRA has brought all of those disciplines under the vehicle resilience.
Yeah. And I think, one of the perennial questions is, if there is ultimately a conflict, say, between a safety requirement and a security requirement, which one should prevail, which one should win, for want of a better way of saying it. I'll have to unashamedly duck that question because because context is everything.
Yeah.
And you'd have to look at the precise nature of the threat, the precise nature of the hazard, in order to deconflict them. But that's why synergies and interactions between the responsible engineering teams are really important.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, that is a challenge that would need context and would need that expertise to be working closely on something like that. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And I think your point about context is everything. And I think that's why, somewhere like HORIBA MIRA has brought those experts together under the vehicle resilience banner.
That's
because,
right,
as you say, it will be a question on each individual case. So I won't make you answer that, don't worry. So we've had a second question come in around ASILs and cybersecurity levels. Is that right?
That's right. Cybersecurity assurance levels.
Assurance levels. There, I've got that right. And again, how do they interact? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So both standards, both 26262 and 21434, have the objective of having a common language, a common approach in the supply chain. That goes back to the earlier question, of course, about why it's really important we have a broad consensus, a broad group of people involved in writing a standard. And 26262 has been very successful, maybe too successful, in establishing ASIL, automotive safety integrity level, as a concept in people's minds. But essentially, when someone at a particular level in the supply chain sets a requirement with an ASIL value associated with it, everyone knows what it means. Everyone recognises that it represents a level of rigour, a level of robustness that you require in the design and implementation of a system, and that the higher ASIL values come with an increasing level of rigour. I said that it's almost become too familiar, because I think people just say, what ASIL value is a particular system, without pausing to think about how ASIL values are actually used in 26262. And in 26262, they're always associated with a safety requirement. So it's really important that people remember that we always talk about safety requirements and ASIL values together. They're not some abstract thing that we should separate, but establishing ASILs as a concept to indicate the level of rigour, the level of robustness that's needed, has been very successful. It was recognised quite early on in cybersecurity that there was a desire to have something similar. That's called cybersecurity assurance level. The concept is still very much a work in progress. It was introduced in 21434, but as what we call an informative piece of content in the standard, so it's not defined as a requirement. There's a supplementary document that's being worked on that will go some way to establishing cybersecurity assurance level as a more developed concept. But I think the general opinion is we still need to get more experience of using it in the industry to see what it means in practice. And I think one of the particular challenges in cybersecurity has always been the dynamic nature of cybersecurity threats, that there's always a new vulnerability being discovered or a new way of exploiting it being discovered. So there's always been this question of how you can have a measure that perhaps is seen as static, as setting the rigor that's required for a development process, versus dealing with the dynamic nature. But there's a lot of good work gone on in the Standards Committee to refine the cybersecurity assurance level concept. So one of the questions that people quite often have is, well, is there any correlation between ASIL values and cybersecurity assurance levels? I think it's fair to say that they'd probably perceive to be some kind of loose coupling, so that higher levels of cybersecurity assurance are probably going to call up similar types of techniques, similar types of methods to the higher ASIL values. And again, we see some common approaches here. So one of the things that everyone's talking about at the moment in cybersecurity is a very technical topic called memory safety. So a lot of vulnerabilities in cybersecurity are because attackers are trying to exploit areas of memory in the system and insert data or access data that they shouldn't have access to. But actually that's a thing in functional safety as well, because invalid or inappropriate access to memory is also something that could be the cause of a malfunction in a functional safety perspective. So some of the techniques that we use for addressing things like memory safety through coding guidelines like MIRA, for example, are actually common to both functional safety and cybersecurity. So I think as the CAL concept matures and becomes more established, more accepted in the industry, we will see a lot of benefits and synergies between them.
So that's really interesting. So we're learning then that actually some of the hazards that have been identified by functional safety also have a threat element to them in terms of cybersecurity.
More in terms of the cause of the hazard.
Right.
Yeah. So the kind of things that we're concerned about that could be exploited by an attacker might also be the kind of thing that could cause a malfunction from a functional safety perspective.
Right, that makes sense. So it's great that we're then able to share that learning.
That's right, yeah. So the classical example from our desktop computer environment is if you get the blue screen of death, for example, sometimes that's caused because a program attempts to access an area of memory that it's not allowed to, so the operating system catches that and says stop. From a functional safety perspective, if that happens, that's a malfunction, and we need to, first of all, prevent that from happening, but if it happens at runtime, respond in a predictable way. From a cybersecurity perspective, attempting to exploit that kind of vulnerability or weakness is the kind of thing that an attacker's in. So by having robust design principles for things like memory access and memory control, it's a benefit for both functional safety and cybersecurity.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.